The security camera footage from Sunset Manor Nursing Home showed Harold Peterson walking through the front entrance at exactly 2. He was wearing his usual brown cardigan, his silver hair neatly combed, carrying the wooden walking stick he'd carved himself during his first month at the facility. What the camera didn't show was that this would be the last time anyone would see Harold Peterson alive. But that's not the most disturbing part of this story. What investigators discovered 3 months later would reveal that Harold Peterson had been living a lie for over 4 decades. And his disappearance from that Wisconsin nursing home would unlock the door to a murder case that had gone cold. And you see, when Harold's body was finally found in the woods behind the facility, the DNA test results didn't just confirm his identity. They revealed something so shocking that it would rewrite everything everyone thought they knew about the quiet, gentle man who had spent his final years playing chess with fellow residents and feeding birds outside his window. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how a simple missing person case turned into one of the most twisted cold case breakthroughs in Wisconsin history, we need to go back to that Tuesday afternoon when Harold Peterson simply walked out of Sunset Manor and vanished into thin air. Harold Peterson had been a model resident at Sunset Manor for 3 years. The 78-year-old retired carpenter from Green Bay had moved into the assisted living facility in August 2016, after his daughter Sarah became concerned about his increasing episodes of confusion and his inability to maintain his small apartment downtown. Harold seemed to adapt well to the routine of institutional living. He woke every morning at 6:30 a.m., ate breakfast in the communal dining room, and spent his days participating in activities that the staff had carefully designed to keep residents engaged and mentally stimulated. Every Tuesday, without fail, Harold would take his afternoon walk through the facility's garden area. The staff at Sunset Manor had learned to expect him at exactly 2, walking slowly along the paved pathways that wound between carefully maintained flower beds and benches positioned to catch the afternoon sun. Harold would typically spend about an hour outside, sometimes stopping to chat with other residents, but more often simply observing the changing seasons from his favorite bench near the oak tree that had been planted when the facility first opened. On October 15, 2019, Harold followed his usual routine perfectly. Nurse Patricia Williams saw him finish his lunch of meatloaf and mashed potatoes in the dining room. Activities coordinator Janet Rodriguez spoke with him briefly around 2:00 p.m. when he declined to join the afternoon bingo game, explaining that he preferred his walk. Kitchen staff member Maria Santos noticed Harold retrieving his cardigan from the coat closet near the front entrance. Everything was perfectly normal, perfectly predictable, perfectly routine, until it wasn't. When Harold failed to return for dinner at 5:30 p.m., the staff initially assumed he had simply lost track of time. Harold occasionally became confused about schedules, a common occurrence among residents dealing with early-stage dementia. But when Patricia Williams went to check on him in his room at 6:15 p.m. and found it empty, concern began to build. Harold never missed dinner. Food was one of the few pleasures he still seemed to fully enjoy, and he had never in 3 years of residence failed to appear in the dining room when the evening meal was served. The security footage revealed the disturbing truth. Harold had indeed left for his usual afternoon walk, but instead of turning left toward the garden area, he had continued straight through the front entrance and out into the parking lot. The cameras showed him walking steadily across the asphalt, his wooden walking stick tapping against the ground with each step. He reached the edge of the facility's property, where the maintained grounds gave way to dense woodland, and simply kept walking. The last clear image showed Harold disappearing into the tree line at 2:49 p.m., just 4 minutes after leaving the building. What made Harold's disappearance so puzzling was his mental state. While he did experience occasional confusion, Harold had never shown any signs of wandering behavior. Residents who attempted to leave the facility without permission typically exhibited obvious distress or agitation. Harold appeared calm, purposeful, as if he knew exactly where he was going and why. The security footage suggested this wasn't a confused elderly man becoming lost, but rather someone making a deliberate decision to leave. The initial search efforts were immediate and comprehensive. Sunset Manor had protocols in place for missing residents, and they were implemented within minutes of discovering Harold's absence. Staff members formed search teams and began combing the wooded area behind the facility, calling Harold's name and using flashlights as daylight faded. The local police department was contacted at 7:15 p.m., and officers arrived within 20 minutes to coordinate a more systematic search effort. Detective Lisa Chen of the Green Bay Police Department took charge of the investigation. Chen was a 15-year veteran with extensive experience in missing person cases, particularly those involving elderly individuals with cognitive impairment. Her first priority was establishing a timeline and gathering information about Harold's mental state, medical condition, and any factors that might explain his sudden departure from the facility. The medical records painted a picture of a man in relatively good health for his age. Harold's dementia was in its early stages, causing occasional confusion about dates or names, but not the severe disorientation that typically led to wandering behavior. He took medication for high blood pressure and arthritis, but nothing that would explain sudden behavioral changes. His daughter Sarah, who visited twice weekly, insisted that Harold had seemed normal during her last visit on Sunday, discussing plans for her upcoming birthday and expressing interest in the facility's Halloween party scheduled for the following week. As the search entered its second day, the scope expanded beyond the immediate area around Sunset Manor. Volunteers from the community joined professional search and rescue teams, creating a grid pattern that extended 5 miles in every direction from where Harold had last been seen. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew over the dense forest, looking for heat signatures that might indicate Harold's location. Search dogs were brought in to follow his scent trail, which led them deep into the woods before mysteriously disappearing near a small creek that ran through the area. The October weather complicated the search efforts significantly. Temperatures dropped below freezing each night, raising concerns about Harold's survival if he was still alive somewhere in the wilderness. He had been wearing only his cardigan over a light shirt, clothing that would provide minimal protection against the harsh Wisconsin autumn. Search teams worked around the clock using high-powered lights to continue their efforts after dark, but the vast expanse of forest and the challenging terrain made it impossible to cover every possible area where Harold might have taken shelter. By the end of the first week, the official search was scaled back to a more targeted effort, focused on areas identified as most likely to yield results. Detective Chen continued her investigation, interviewing every staff member and resident at Sunset Manor who might have insight into Harold's state of mind or potential reasons for leaving. What emerged was a consistent picture of a man who had seemed content with his life at the facility, who had established routines and relationships that appeared to satisfy his needs. The interviews did reveal one potentially significant detail. Several residents reported that Harold had seemed more introspective than usual during the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Agnes Miller, who often sat with Harold during meals, mentioned that he had been asking unusual questions about forgiveness and redemption. Robert Hughes, Harold's occasional chess partner, recalled conversations where Harold seemed preoccupied with memories from his past, particularly his younger years working construction in Milwaukee during the 1970s. These observations suggested that Harold might have been struggling with memories or guilt about something from his past, but none of the residents could provide specific details about what might have been troubling him. The facility's records showed that Harold had never discussed his earlier life in detail with staff members, preferring to focus on his immediate needs and daily activities rather than reminiscing about previous decades.
The investigation took an unexpected turn when Detective Chen decided to examine Harold's personal belongings more carefully. His room at Sunset Manor contained the typical possessions of a long-term care resident: photographs of family members, a few books, clothing appropriate for institutional living, and various personal items that provided comfort and familiarity. But hidden beneath a stack of magazines in Harold's dresser drawer, Chen discovered a manila envelope containing documents that cast his past in a very different light. The envelope contained newspaper clippings from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, all dated from August and September 1979. The articles described the exhibition into the disappearance of Maria Santos, a 34-year-old secretary who had vanished from her apartment in Milwaukee's Third Ward. Maria had last been seen leaving work at a construction company downtown, and her car had been found abandoned in a parking garage 3 blocks from her apartment building. The case had received significant media attention because Maria was a single mother whose 8-year-old daughter had been staying with relatives when she disappeared. What made these clippings significant was Harold's apparent obsession with preserving them. The newspaper articles had been carefully cut out and stored in chronological order, with certain passages highlighted in yellow marker. Notes written in Harold's handwriting filled the margins, mostly questions about the investigation's progress and speculation about what might have happened to Maria Santos. Some of the notes appeared to be recent, suggesting that Harold had continued to revisit these materials regularly even 40 years after Maria's disappearance. Detective Chen immediately contacted the Milwaukee Police Department to inquire about the Santos case. The investigation had gone cold within months of Maria's disappearance, with no viable suspects and no physical evidence that pointed toward foul play. The case remained officially open, but it hadn't been actively investigated in decades. The detective who had originally worked the case, now retired, confirmed that construction workers had been interviewed as potential witnesses since Maria's workplace put her in contact with men from various building sites around the city. The connection between Harold Peterson and Maria Santos remained unclear, but the newspaper clippings suggested some level of involvement or at least obsessive interest that went far beyond normal community concern about a missing person case. Chen requested Harold's employment records from the 1970s, hoping to determine whether he had worked for any of the construction companies that had been investigated in connection with Maria's disappearance. While waiting for those records, the search for Harold continued with renewed urgency. The discovery of the newspaper clippings had transformed his disappearance from a simple case of an elderly man with dementia becoming lost in the woods, to a potential criminal investigation with implications that stretched back 4 decades. If Harold had been involved in Maria Santos' disappearance, his decision to walk into the forest might represent something more sinister than confusion or despair. The breakthrough came on January 18, 2020, exactly 3 months and 3 days after Harold's disappearance. A group of cross-country skiers exploring the trails behind Sunset Manor discovered what appeared to be clothing caught in the branches of a fallen tree about 2 miles from where Harold had last been seen on the security camera. The brown cardigan was immediately recognizable as the one Harold had been wearing, and closer examination of the area revealed additional items: his walking stick, broken into 2 pieces, and eventually Harold's remains. The body was discovered in a natural depression beside a frozen creek, partially concealed by fallen leaves and debris that had accumulated over the winter months. The location was less than 50 yards from where the skiers had found the cardigan, in an area that search teams had passed through multiple times but where the terrain and vegetation had prevented a thorough examination. Harold appeared to have died from exposure, though the exact cause of death would require forensic analysis to determine definitively. What happened next would transform Harold Peterson's death from a tragic end to an elderly man's life into one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in Wisconsin history. Detective Chen, still puzzled by the newspaper clippings found in Harold's room, decided to request DNA analysis of his remains. Standard procedure didn't require such testing for what appeared to be an accidental death, but Chen's instincts told her that Harold's story might be more complex than it initially appeared. The DNA sample was processed at the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory in Madison, where technician Sarah Williams extracted genetic material from Harold's remains and ran it through the state's database of criminal cases. What she found sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Harold Peterson's DNA was a perfect match for biological evidence that had been collected from Maria Santos's apartment in 1979 but had never been successfully analyzed due to the limitations of forensic technology at the time. The evidence consisted of hair fibers and skin cells that crime scene investigators had recovered from Maria's bedroom, preserved in evidence bags that had sat in storage for over 40 years waiting for scientific advances that could unlock their secret. The DNA match provided conclusive proof that Harold Peterson had been present in Maria Santos's apartment at some point before her disappearance, establishing a direct connection between the quiet nursing home resident and a murder case that had remained unsolved for 4 decades. But the story was far from over. The DNA evidence was just the beginning of an investigation that would reveal Harold Peterson's true identity and expose a pattern of violence that had remained hidden for most of his adult life. Detective Chen contacted Milwaukee Police Department's cold case unit, and within days a joint task force was formed to examine the implications of the DNA match and determine what other crimes Harold might have been connected to. The employment records that Chen had requested weeks earlier finally arrived, confirming that Harold Peterson had indeed worked for Morrison Construction Company in Milwaukee during the summer of 19. The company had been contracted to renovate several buildings in the 3rd Ward, including the office complex where Maria Santos worked. This placed Harold in the right location at the right time to have encountered Maria, and his access to construction sites throughout the area would have given him detailed knowledge of the neighborhood where she disappeared. More disturbing was the discovery that Morrison Construction had employed Harold on multiple projects throughout the Milwaukee area during the late 1970s and early 1980s, periods that corresponded with several other unsolved missing person cases involving young women. Detective Patricia Rodriguez, who led Milwaukee's cold case unit, began the painstaking process of cross-referencing Harold's work history with open cases from that era, looking for patterns that might indicate a serial offender who had managed to avoid detection for decades. The psychological profile that emerged painted a picture of a man who had successfully compartmentalized his violent impulses while maintaining the facade of a reliable, hard-working tradesman. Harold's employment records showed steady work and positive evaluations from supervisors who remembered him as punctual, skilled, and easy to work with. His neighbors in the apartment building where he lived during the 1980s described him as quiet and polite, someone who kept to himself but was always willing to help with minor repairs or maintenance tasks. This ability to present a normal, helpful exterior while concealing predatory behavior was consistent with profiles of serial killers who operated successfully for extended periods without detection. Harold's job as a construction worker provided him with mobility, access to potential victims, and legitimate reasons to be in various neighborhoods throughout Milwaukee. The transient nature of construction work also meant that he could disappear from areas after committing crimes, reducing the likelihood of witnesses connecting him to multiple incidents.
The investigation expanded to include missing person cases from other cities where Harold had lived or worked. His employment history showed periods in Madison, Eau Claire, and Green Bay, each corresponding with construction projects that had taken him away from Milwaukee for months at a time. Detectives in each of these jurisdictions began reviewing their cold case files, looking for unsolved disappearances that might be connected to Harold's presence in their communities. The breakthrough that would ultimately reveal the full scope of Harold's crimes came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, Maria's daughter who had been 8 years old when her mother disappeared, had spent decades searching for answers about what had happened. Now 48 years old and working as a social worker in Chicago, Margaret had maintained contact with Milwaukee police and had submitted her DNA to genealogy databases in hopes that advances in forensic science might eventually identify her mother's killer. When Detective Rodriguez contacted Margaret to inform her about the DNA match with Harold Peterson, Margaret's response was immediate and surprising. She recognized the name. Harold Peterson had been one of the construction workers who had performed maintenance on the office building where her mother worked during the weeks before her disappearance. Margaret remembered her mother mentioning that one of the workers had been asking personal questions about her schedule and her living situation, questions that had made Maria uncomfortable enough to mention them at home. This revelation provided crucial context for understanding how Harold had selected and targeted his victims. Rather than random encounters, his crimes appeared to involve careful observation and planning. His position as a construction worker gave him opportunities to interact with potential victims in professional settings where his presence wouldn't seem threatening or unusual. He could learn about their routines, their personal lives, and their vulnerabilities while maintaining the pretense of simply doing his job. The forensic re-examination of Maria Santos's apartment, using modern crime scene analysis techniques, revealed additional evidence that had been missed or misinterpreted in microscopic traces of construction materials found in Maria's bedroom, matched samples from the renovation project at her office building, providing additional confirmation of Harold's presence at the scene. More significantly, investigators discovered evidence suggesting that Maria's disappearance had been carefully planned rather than opportunistic. Personal items that appeared to be missing from Maria's apartment included clothing and toiletries that would be necessary for an extended absence, suggesting that Harold had forced her to pack a bag before taking her from her home. This indicated a level of premeditation and organization that was consistent with someone who had committed similar crimes before and had developed methods for avoiding detection. The search for Maria Santos' remains became a priority for the Joint Task Force. Harold's newspaper clippings had contained detailed maps of Milwaukee with certain areas marked in red ink, locations that investigators now realized might indicate where he had disposed of his victims' bodies. Ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs were deployed to search these areas, focusing on construction sites where Harold had worked and where he would have had access to heavy equipment that could be used to conceal evidence. The first discovery came in March 2020, when searchers found human remains buried beneath what had been the foundation of a building demolished in DNA analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to Maria Santos, finally providing her daughter with the closure she had sought for over 40 years. But Maria's grave also contained evidence of Harold's other crimes, personal belongings that belonged to at least 3 other women who had disappeared from Milwaukee during the early. This discovery opened new avenues of investigation as detectives worked to identify the other victims and determine the full extent of Harold's criminal activity. The belongings included jewelry, identification documents, and clothing that provided clues about women who had vanished without a trace decades earlier. Each item represented not just evidence of a crime but a life that had been cut short and families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved one. The investigation revealed that Harold Peterson had been one of Wisconsin's most prolific serial killers, responsible for at least 7 murders, spanning from 9. His victims were all young women between the ages of 24 and 35, most of whom lived alone and worked in areas where Harold had legitimate reasons to be present. His method of operation involved careful observation and planning, followed by abduction from the victims' homes during evening hours when they were unlikely to be missed until the following day. What made Harold particularly dangerous was his ability to gain his victims' trust before attacking them. Several witnesses who had encountered him during the period when he was actively killing described him as helpful and polite, someone who offered assistance with carrying groceries or provided directions when asked. This facade of helpfulness allowed him to get close to potential victims without triggering their defensive instincts,
making it easier for him to overpower them when the opportunity arose. The psychological analysis of Harold's behavior patterns revealed a man who was driven by a need for control and domination that he satisfied through violence against vulnerable women. His choice of victims, young women living independently in urban areas, reflected both his preferences and his assessment of who would be easiest to target without generating immediate police attention. The fact that he preserved newspaper clippings about his crimes suggested that he derived ongoing satisfaction from reliving his violent acts and following the investigations into his victims' disappearances. Harold's decision to walk into the forest behind Sunset Manor on that October afternoon appeared to have been motivated by his realization that advances in DNA technology would eventually expose his crime. The newspaper clippings found in his room included recent articles about cold cases being solved through genetic genealogy, suggesting that he understood the implications of these developments for his own situation. Rather than face arrest and trial, he had chosen to end his life on his own terms, taking his secrets with him into the Wisconsin wilderness. The case of Harold Peterson demonstrated how effectively serial killers could hide within ordinary communities, using legitimate employment and social relationships to mask their predatory behavior. His crimes had remained undetected for over 40 years, not because of sophisticated criminal techniques, but because he had understood how to blend into the social fabric of his communities, while carefully selecting victims whose disappearances wouldn't generate sustained investigation effort. For the families of Harold's victims, his death represented both closure and frustration. They finally had answers about what had happened to their loved ones, but they would never have the opportunity to confront the man who had destroyed their lives, or to hear him explain why he had chosen to kill their daughters, sisters, and mother. The justice they had sought for decades would have to come from the knowledge that Harold Peterson could never hurt anyone again, and from the peace of finally knowing the truth about their loss. Detective Chen's decision to pursue DNA testing despite the apparent straightforward nature of Harold's death had prevented one of Wisconsin's most significant serial murder cases from remaining forever unsolved. Her instincts about the newspaper clippings and her willingness to look beyond the obvious explanations had provided justice for multiple families and closure for cases that had haunted law enforcement for generations.
The Harold Peterson case also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence, even when immediate analysis isn't possible, as technological advances can eventually unlock secrets that older forensic methods couldn't reveal. The DNA evidence that solved these murders had been sitting in storage for over 40 years, waiting for the science to catch up with the needs of criminal investigation. As investigators continued to piece together the full scope of Harold Peterson's crimes, they discovered that his story was far more complex than anyone had initially realized. The quiet, gentle man who had spent his final years at Sunset Manor feeding birds and playing chess had been one of the most dangerous predators in Wisconsin's criminal history, and his death had finally allowed his victims to rest in peace. But there was still more to uncover about Harold's methodology that would chill investigators to the bone. During the search of his former residences, cold case detectives made discoveries that revealed just how calculated and organized his killing spree had been. In a storage unit that Harold had maintained for over 30 years, investigators found what could only be described as a serial killer's trophy collection. Items that would connect him to even more victims than they had initially suspected. The storage unit, rented under an alias in 1983 and paid for annually in cash, contained detailed maps of Milwaukee, Madison, and Green Bay with locations marked in different colored ink. Red marks indicated where Harold had stalked potential victims, blue marks showed where he had successfully abducted women, and black marks, the most chilling of all, indicated burial sites that investigators were only beginning to explore. The meticulous nature of his record-keeping suggested a man who took pride in his crimes and wanted to preserve every detail of his violent acts. Detective Rodriguez found herself staring at boxes filled with driver's licenses, social security cards, and personal jewelry belonging to women who had disappeared across Wisconsin during the late night. Each box was labeled with dates and contained what appeared to be Harold's personal notes about his victims, their daily routines, their fears, their vulnerability. The psychological profile that emerged was of a predator who had studied his targets like a scientist conducting research, learning everything possible about them before making his move. The investigation expanded when forensic analysis of items from the storage unit revealed DNA evidence linking Harold to cases in 3 additional states. Construction industry records showed that Harold had worked on projects in Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois during periods when young women had disappeared in those areas. The revelation that Harold's crimes might have extended far beyond Wisconsin prompted the formation of a multi-state task force to coordinate investigations across jurisdictional boundaries.
Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic psychologist brought in to analyze Harold's behavior patterns, described him as one of the most organized and methodical serial killers she had encountered in 20 years of studying criminal behavior. His ability to maintain employment, housing, and social relationships while simultaneously carrying out a multi-decade killing spree required a level of compartmentalization that was both rare and extremely dangerous. Harold hadn't simply been killing when opportunities arose, he had been actively hunting, using his construction work as cover for a systematic campaign of violence against vulnerable women. The storage unit also contained Harold's journals, written in his own hand and detailing not just his crimes but his psychological evolution as a killer. The earliest entries, dating from 1976, showed a man struggling with violent fantasies and attempting to resist his urge. But as the entries progressed through the years, they revealed Harold's growing confidence in his ability to kill without detection, and his increasing sophistication in selecting and stalking victims. One particularly disturbing entry, written in 1982, described Harold's method for choosing burial sites. Construction gives me access to places that will be disturbed and built over. No one looks for bodies under new foundations. The city grows and covers my work. This revelation prompted investigators to examine construction projects Harold had worked on throughout his career, leading to the discovery of additional remains at sites where buildings, parking lots, and infrastructure projects had been completed during the forensic excavation of these sites became a massive undertaking involving multiple law enforcement agencies, archaeological specialists, and victim identification expert. Ground-penetrating radar surveys identified anomalies consistent with buried human remains at 7 different locations where Harold had worked. Each excavation was conducted with the care of an archaeological dig, as investigators needed to preserve evidence while also treating the recovered remains with dignity and respect. The first additional victim identified through these excavations was Jennifer Walsh, a 28-year-old bank teller who had disappeared from Madison, and Jennifer's family had never given up hope of finding answers, and her sister Patricia had become an advocate for missing persons cases throughout Wisconsin. When Detective Chen called Patricia to inform her that Jennifer's remains had been found, the conversation was both heartbreaking and cathartic. 41 years of uncertainty finally replaced by terrible but definitive knowledge. Jennifer's case revealed new details about Harold's evolving methodology. Unlike his earlier victims, Jennifer had been abducted from a parking garage rather than her home, suggesting that Harold had begun taking greater risks as his confidence grew. The crime scene evidence indicated that he had waited for Jennifer to return to her car after work, overpowered her in the relative privacy of the parking structure, and transported her to a construction site where he killed her before burying her body beneath what would become the foundation of an office building. The systematic nature of Harold's crimes became even more apparent as investigators analyzed the timeline of his killings in relation to his work schedule. Construction industry records showed that Harold had specifically sought out projects that would take him to different cities and neighborhoods, maximizing his opportunities to identify potential victims while minimizing the chance that patterns would be detected across multiple jurisdictions. He had essentially used the construction industry as a hunting ground, moving from project to project and city to city while leaving a trail of death behind him. Dr. Foster's psychological analysis revealed that Harold had likely begun killing much earlier than investigators initially suspected. His journals contained references to practice runs and early experiments that dated back to his teenage years, suggesting that he had been refining his techniques for decades before his first confirmed murder. This possibility prompted investigators to examine missing person cases from the 1960s and early 1970s, looking for evidence that Harold's criminal career might have begun when he was still a young man learning the construction trade. The expanded investigation uncovered evidence linking Harold to at least 12 additional victims across 4 states, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in Midwest history. Each new discovery brought both answers and anguish to families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones. The victims ranged in age from 9, and all shared certain characteristics that had apparently attracted Harold's attention. They were young women living independently, working in areas where he had legitimate access, and following predictable routines that made them easy to observe and target. Margaret Santos, whose mother Maria had been Harold's first confirmed victim, found herself serving as an unofficial advocate for the other victim's family. Her experience navigating the criminal justice system and dealing with media attention made her a valuable resource for families who were suddenly thrust into the spotlight as their loved ones' cases received renewed attention. Margaret organized support groups and worked with victim services organizations to ensure that families had access to counseling and legal assistance as the investigation progressed. The media coverage of Harold's case sparked national discussions about the challenges of investigating serial crimes that span multiple jurisdictions and decades. Law enforcement officials acknowledged that Harold had been able to continue killing for so long partly because communication between agencies had been limited during the night. The case prompted reforms in information sharing protocols and highlighted the importance of maintaining DNA databases that could eventually solve cold cases through advancing technology. Harold's daughter Sarah, who had been visiting him regularly at Sunset Manor, struggled to reconcile the loving grandfather she knew with the monster revealed by the investigation. In a statement released through her attorney, Sarah expressed her shock and horror at learning about her father's crimes while also acknowledging the pain of his victim's family. She committed to cooperating fully with investigators and to ensuring that any assets from Harold's estate would be used to support victim services organization.
Harold's daughter Sarah, who had been visiting him regularly at Sunset Manor, struggled to reconcile the loving grandfather she knew with the monster revealed by the investigation. In a statement released through her attorney, Sarah expressed her shock and horror at learning about her father's crimes, while also acknowledging the pain of his victims' families. She committed to cooperating fully with investigators and to ensuring that any assets from Harold's estate would be used to support victim services organization. The investigation into Harold Peterson's crimes ultimately identified 17 confirmed victims and suggested connections to as many as 23 additional cases. His killing career had spanned from approximately 1977 to 1985. During which time he had used his position as a construction worker to gain access to potential victims and to conceal evidence of his crimes. The geographic scope of his activities, stretching across multiple states, had prevented law enforcement agencies from recognizing the patterns that might have led to his earlier detection. The psychological impact of Harold's case extended far beyond his immediate victims and their family. Residents of communities where he had lived and worked struggled with the realization that they had unknowingly interacted with a serial killer for years. Former coworkers remembered sharing lunch breaks and casual conversations with a man who had been actively hunting and killing women. Neighbors recalled Harold's helpfulness with household repairs and his quiet presence at community events, never suspecting the darkness he concealed behind his ordinary facade. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of women living alone in urban areas during the late 20th century. Harold had specifically targeted women who lived independently and worked in areas where they might encounter construction workers during their daily routines. His victims had been following normal patterns of work and social activity, making routine decisions about their daily lives, when they encountered a predator who had been carefully studying their movements and waiting for opportunities to strike. Detective Chen's investigation revealed that Harold had maintained detailed surveillance of his potential victims, sometimes observing them for weeks or months before deciding whether to act. His construction work provided perfect cover for this surveillance, as his presence in various neighborhoods seemed natural and unremarkable. He could observe women's comings and goings, learn their schedules and habits, and identify moments when they would be most vulnerable to attack. The forensic evidence recovered from Harold's various crime scenes painted a picture of a killer who had grown increasingly confident and sophisticated over time. His early murders showed signs of impulsivity and poor planning, but his later crimes demonstrated careful preparation and attention to detail that made detection much more difficult. He had learned from his mistakes and had developed techniques for quickly overpowering victims, transporting them to secure locations, and disposing of evidence in ways that would prevent discovery. The final chapter of Harold Peterson's story unfolded in courtrooms across multiple states, as prosecutors worked to officially close cases that had remained open for decades. Although Harold could never be brought to trial due to his death, the formal closure of these cases provided important legal recognition of his victims and allowed their families to access resources and support services that had previously been unavailable to them. The Harold Peterson case stands as a testament to the importance of preserving evidence, even when immediate analysis isn't possible, and to the dedication of investigators who refuse to let cold cases remain forever unsolved. Detective Chen's decision to pursue DNA testing on what appeared to be a straightforward case of an elderly man dying from exposure had unlocked one of the most significant criminal investigations in Wisconsin history, and had provided justice for victims whose families had waited decades for answers. As investigators prepared to close the books on Harold Peterson's crimes, they reflected on the lessons learned from a case that had revealed how effectively a serial killer could hide within ordinary society. Harold's story served as a reminder that evil often wears a familiar face, and that the monsters we fear might be the helpful neighbors, reliable coworkers, and quiet residents who seem to represent the best of their community. His death in the woods behind Sunset Manor had ended a reign of terror that had lasted over 40 years,
But the scars left by his crimes would continue to affect the families and communities he had devastated for generations to come. The aftermath of Harold's case brought unexpected developments that would continue to shock investigators long after they thought they had uncovered all of his secrets. In February 2021, more than a year after his death, construction workers renovating Harold's childhood home in Green Bay made a discovery that would add another horrifying chapter to his story. Behind a false wall in the basement, they found a collection of children's belongings, toys, clothing and personal items that clearly didn't belong to Harold or his family. Detective Chen was called to the scene, and what she saw made her realize that Harold Peterson's crimes might have begun much earlier than anyone had imagined. The items appeared to date from the 1960s, when Harold would have been a teenager living in the house with his parents. More disturbing still, several of the items matched descriptions of belongings that had disappeared with children who had gone missing from the Green Bay area during that decade. Cases that had never been solved and had been largely forgotten by law enforcement. The revelation that Harold might have been killing since his teenage years prompted a complete re-examination of missing children cases from Green Bay during the cold case. Detective Maria Gonzalez was assigned to lead this new phase of the investigation, working with aged evidence and witness statements that in some cases were over 50 years old. The challenge was immense. Many of the original investigators had died, witnesses had scattered or passed away, and evidence from that era had been stored under conditions that made forensic analysis extremely difficult. However, the investigation yielded disturbing results. DNA analysis of several items found in Harold's childhood home basement matched genetic profiles from evidence collected during the original investigations of 3 missing children cases. The victims were Timothy Chen, age 8, who had disappeared while riding his bicycle to school, Susan Martinez, age 10, who had vanished from a playground near her home, and David Williams, age 7, who had been last seen walking to a corner store to buy candy. The families of these children had endured over 50 years of uncertainty, never knowing whether their loved ones had been kidnapped, murdered, or had somehow survived and were living somewhere under different identities. The DNA evidence from Harold's basement cache finally provided the answers they had sought for half a century, but the truth was more horrible than anything they had imagined during their decades of hoping and wonder. Timothy Chen's mother, now 89 years old, and living in a nursing home in Milwaukee, broke down when Detective Gonzalez informed her that her son's case had finally been solved. She had spent 54 years wondering what had happened to Timothy, never remarrying, because she couldn't bear the thought of moving on while her son's fate remained unknown. The confirmation that Harold Peterson had killed Timothy provided closure, but also opened wounds that had never fully healed. The investigation into Harold's childhood revealed warning signs that had been overlooked or misunderstood by adults in his life during the 90s. School records showed that Harold had displayed behavioral problems from an early age, including cruelty to animals and inappropriate interest in younger children. Teachers had noted his tendency to isolate himself and his disturbing drawings that depicted violence and death. However, in an era when understanding of childhood psychological disorders was limited, these signs had been dismissed as phase that Harold would eventually outgrow. Harold's parents, both deceased by the time his crimes were discovered, had apparently been aware of their son's disturbing behavior but had chosen to hide it rather than seek help. Family members who were still alive revealed that Harold's mother had mentioned finding troubling things in his bedroom during his teenage years, but she had never specified what those things were or taken any action to address them. The culture of the 1960s, which emphasized keeping family problems private, had prevented Harold from receiving the psychological intervention that might have prevented his later crimes.
Dr. Foster's expanded psychological profile revealed that Harold Peterson represented an extremely rare category of serial killer, someone who had begun killing in childhood and had continued throughout his adult life with only brief periods of inactivity. His ability to escalate from killing children to targeting adult women demonstrated a level of adaptability and criminal sophistication that made him one of the most dangerous offenders in American criminal history. The discovery of Harold's childhood crimes also explained certain aspects of his adult behavior that had puzzled investigators. His choice to work in construction, his frequent moves between cities, and his careful selection of victims who lived alone all made more sense when viewed as tactics developed over decades of criminal experience. Harold hadn't simply been a construction worker who happened to kill. He had been a killer who had chosen construction work because it provided perfect cover for his crimes. The expanded investigation revealed that Harold had killed at least 21 people over a span of more than 40 years, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. His victims ranged from children as young as 7 to adults in their 30s,
and his crimes had taken place across multiple states and decades. The geographic and temporal scope of his activities had prevented law enforcement agencies from recognizing the patterns that might have led to his earlier detection. The Harold Peterson case became a landmark in criminal investigation, demonstrating both the power of modern forensic science to solve decades-old cases and the importance of interagency cooperation in tracking serial offenders who operate across jurisdictional boundaries. The case prompted changes in how missing person investigations are conducted and how evidence is preserved for future analysis, using technologies that don't yet exist. For the families of Harold's victims, the resolution of these cases brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. After decades of uncertainty, they finally had answers about what had happened to their loved ones, but those answers confirmed their worst fears and forced them to confront the reality that their children, sisters, daughters, and mothers had died at the hands of a monster who had continued living a normal life for decades after destroying theirs. The story of Harold Peterson serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades and that the people we trust most might be the ones capable of the greatest harm. His transformation from a helpful nursing home resident to one of America's most notorious serial killers demonstrates the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and remaining vigilant for signs of predatory behavior, even in the most unexpected places. As the investigation finally drew to a close, Detective Chen reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple missing person case and had ended with the exposure of one of the most extensive criminal enterprises in Wisconsin history. Harold Peterson's death in the woods behind Sunset Manor had initially seemed like a tragic end to an elderly man's life, but it had actually been the key that unlocked decades of hidden crimes and provided justice for victims whose families had waited lifetimes for answers. The case of Harold Peterson will be studied by criminal investigators, forensic scientists, and behavioral analysts for years to come, serving as both a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk within ordinary communities and a testament to the power of persistence in advancing technology to eventually bring even the most carefully concealed crimes to light.